For as long as I can remember, white and blue have always been my two favorite colors in Magic. With blue, I love the joy of being able to counter spells, draw cards, bounce my opponent's creatures back into their hands, all the while allowing mine to remain untouchable. While with white, it's the fun that comes with being able to pacify or exile my opponent's creatures, and then swing in with a first striker that has sweet, sweet lifelink. Then of course there are the bits of common ground that these two colors share, like being able to tap down creatures or flash your own in from out of nowhere, or the way that white and blue typically dominate the skies with by far the largest number of flying creatures in the game. And while we're talking about favorites, Pauper has quickly become one of my favorite formats in Magic over the past few years, second only to maybe Commander. So given all that, it shouldn't be surprising to know that I've been slowly testing and tweaking a little Pauper brew that will allow me not just to have fun, but will also let me play with all my favorite toys that blue and white slices of the color wheel have to offer. And so I present to you my Flight of the Godhead deck. The premise of this deck is fairly simple. You want to get a number of low-cost blue-white creatures on the board, most of which will gain bonuses from other multicolored permanents or spells. You then buff these creatures up further with beneficial enchantments while protecting them with various bits of removal, bounce, and counter spells. So now that you know the general game plan, it's time to get into the deck itself, starting with the creatures. First up from Alara Reborn, we've got Bant Sureblade and Esper Stormblade. Both are 2/1 creatures that can be cast for just 1 white and 1 blue, with each gaining a +1/+1 bonus as long as you control another multicolored permanent. On top of that, Sureblade also gains First Strike, and Stormblade gains Flying. Now, given the fact that the lion's share of this deck is comprised of multicolored permanents, you shouldn't have any trouble getting their special abilities online, at the very least by turn 3, and that is providing if A, they haven't already been triggered the moment they came into play, or B, they haven't been buffed up even further by another more beneficial multicolored permanent. Now, since these two comprise a large portion of the backbone of this deck, basically if either or both of these guys are in your opening hand, you're already off to a great start. The only other creatures we're running a full playset of in this deck are the reigning tag team champions of Shadowmoor, the Thistledown Duo. A little more costly at a CMC of 3, the Duo is a 2/2 creature that can be cast using either blue or white mana. As well, white spells you cast give them +1/+1, while blue spells will give them Flying. Now, unlike with the Stormblade and Sureblade, the Duo's bonuses aren't permanent. However, there isn't a single spell in the deck that won't trigger at least one of these two abilities, and most spells you'll be casting will trigger them both at the same time, so I found that typically makes up for the difference. Moving on, we have the two creatures that we're running 3 copies of, Mulldrifter and Zealous Guardian. Mulldrifter has the distinction of being both the highest cost spell as well as the only monocolored creature in both the main and sideboard of this deck, so while it does lack the same type of synergy that the other multicolored creatures share, the card draw ability of this Pauper staple, along with its 2/2 flying late game body, is invaluable to the deck. Going from one extreme to the other, we have Zealous Guardian, another card from Shadowmoor, which is the lowest cost creature in the deck. And while on the surface this 1/1 for either 1 blue or 1 white may not seem super sexy or dangerous, it does have its uses. First, as a multicolored 1-drop, if you can get it out on turn 1, it will allow both the Sureblade and Stormblade's abilities to come online the second after they hit the board on turn 2. Plus, as a white and blue spell, it will trigger both the Duo's abilities when you cast it. And then to top it all off, because it has Flash, you can essentially trigger any and all of these effects at instant speed, something that can prove to be a very useful trick post-blocks when you're either attacking or defending, or even pre-blocks on defense if you just need another 1/1 body to throw in front of your enemy's creatures. All in all, this little 1/1 for 1 can prove to be a huge benefit to your army. And finally, we have the last 2 creatures in the main deck, Somnomancer and Deputy of Acquittals, both of which we'll be running just 2 copies of apiece. It's pretty straightforward as to why Somnomancer, yet another creature that hails from Shadowmoor, is part of the deck. First off, it's a nice cheap 2-drop, 2/1 multicolored permanent. And secondly, its come into play ability to tap another creature can be useful throughout the game, but especially mid to late game if you find yourself in a position where you need to make a hole in your opponent's defenses to get that last little bit of damage through. And last but certainly not least, we have the 2/2 for 2 from Dragon's Maze, Deputy of Acquittals. Much like with the Zealous Guardian, the Deputy's Flash ability can act as a sneaky trigger to your other creatures' abilities, as well as a much needed chump blocker, but it also has another great use. Its come into play ability allows you to return another creature you control to your hand, which could save one of your creatures from an unfavorable block or falling victim to a bit of removal. More importantly though, it can also return creatures like Somnomancer and Mulldrifter to your hand so that you can then cast them again, allowing you to take advantage of their come into play abilities a second time. Now, while I do like both Somnomancer and Deputy of Acquittals in the deck, I think they're both more useful during the mid to late game, which is why I've only included 2 copies of each in the deck. As well, I usually find one or the other is typically the first pick for me when I need to sideboard something out between games. However, they've both proven useful enough during testing that I feel good about keeping them in the main deck. Well, that takes care of the creatures, so let's move on now to the support spells. To kick things off, I'll go over a few Pauper staples found in this deck that I'm sure most of you are already familiar with. Incidentally, along with the aforementioned Mulldrifter, these next 3 cards are the only monocolored spells in the main deck. We have both a playset of Counterspell and Oblivion Ring, as well as 2 copies of Preordain. Now, all of these are pretty self-explanatory, I think. Counterspell is in here because, well, it's Counterspell. Granted, this is not a mono-blue deck, so there might be other counterspells that some of you would consider a better fit. But personally, I've never found holding up 2 blue for this instant speed FU to be too troublesome, so I've stuck with using the classic in this deck. Next, we've got Oblivion Ring for some good old-fashioned removal. I realize an argument could be made here for Journey to Nowhere instead due to its cheaper casting cost, but for me, I think the added flexibility of being able to remove any non-land permanent rather than just creatures is well worth the single extra generic mana. And then there's Preordain for a bit of deck filtering and card draw. Keep in mind Ponder, Serum Visions, or even Brainstorm are all good substitutions for this card, so feel free to swap this out for any of those. Even Gitaxian Probe or Peak could be possible replacements if you find filtering is less important than being able to see what your opponent is holding. For me though, it comes down to personal taste, and over time I've just found Preordain to edge out the others in this deck. Alrighty, let's set aside those spells that you've no doubt seen time and time again in blue and white Pauper decks, and instead talk about a few that you might not be quite as familiar with, but are still integral to this particular deck. We have 4 copies of the namesake for this deck, Steel of the Godhead, followed by 2 copies each of Wings of Hope, Shielding Plax, and finally Stormcaller's Boon. First and most importantly, direct from Shadowmoor, the 3-drop enchantment Steel of the Godhead. For 2 in either a white or blue, this aura will give white creatures enchants +1/+1 and lifelink, and blue creatures +1/+1 and unblockable, which means, other than Mulldrifter, any creature in this deck enchanted with this card will get +2/+2 lifelink and unblockable. If you cast it on the Thistledown Duo, you have a 5/5 unblockable flying lifelinker the first turn, and a 4/4 unblockable lifelinker the next. Put it on either the Stormblade or the Sureblade, and you got yourself a permanent 5/4 unblockable lifelinker with either flying or first strike. Hell, even the Zealous Guardian becomes a respectable 3/3 unblockable lifelinker. Basically, what I'm saying is this is the card you most want to get out there on pretty much any one of your creatures as soon as possible. Now, I'm not saying you can't win with this deck if you don't get this spell to stick, as there have been games that I won where all casting this managed to do was stamp a sign on my creature's forehead that said, cast removal here, and poof, it was gone before I could ever swing in with it. But typically, it really helps your odds of winning if Steel of the Godhead is on one of your creatures. Next up, we go all the way back to the Invasion expansion for 2 copies of Wings of Hope. Now, for 1 white and blue, giving a creature +1/+3 and flying may not seem like a huge deal, especially since a few creatures in this deck will either gain or already have flying to begin with, but I've honestly found it to be quite useful. Not only does it trigger the Sureblade, Stormblade, and Duo, but even if you put it on something like the Zealous Guardian or the Somnomancer, not only do you suddenly have a flyer, but you've also got a relatively useful blocker as well. Most importantly though, no matter what you put this on, you've now put it out of lightning bolt range, which is important because chances are if you played more than 2 games of Pauper, you've played against a red deck. And red decks in Pauper that don't run 4 copies of lightning bolts are a bit like unicorns or clowns that are actually funny and not creepy, which is to say they don't exist. Speaking of removal, sometimes you'll have more than just lightning bolts to worry about, as removal can come in all the colors of the mana wheel. So while an earlier version of this deck contained 4 copies of Wings of Hope, I've since cut those back to 2 and filled the gap with 2 copies of Shielding Plax from Dissension. Now, 2 things of note regarding this spell before I get into how it interacts with the rest of the deck. 1, yes, while it's still a multicolored permanent, it's not a blue-white spell. And 2, was Dissension set on Planet Hulk? Seriously, Dissension came out May 2006 and Planet Hulk started April 2006, and look. I mean, ignore the tentacles and the scorching case of Phyrexian herpes or whatever the big green dude has going on here, but this could be a panel from Planet Hulk, or am I crazy? Anyway, despite not being white-blue, Shielding Plax still fits well in this deck as a multicolored permanent, so both the Sureblade and Stormblade can take full advantage of its presence. But more importantly, it's some solid protection from targeted removal like Doomblade or even Pacifism. Slap this on one of your creatures, especially one that is already enjoying a boost from Steel of the Godhead, and your opponent will have a much harder time getting rid of your buffed up attacker. Granted, it won't help much if your opponent casts something like Diabolic or Chainer's Edict, but to get around that, I'd suggest keeping one of your Zealous Guardians in hand to flash out as a sacrificial Kithkin if needed. Oh, and one final note regarding a far less likely, though still potentially viable use for Shielding Plax, you can also cast this on one of your opponent's creatures to log them out from targeting it. Now this certainly isn't its main purpose in the deck, and since it lacks flash, it will be tough to execute in a timely fashion, but when it works, there is something deeply satisfying about slapping this on a creature the turn before your opponent can cast that Rancor or Armadillo Cloak on it that you just know they have in hand. And now we come to the last non-land card in the main deck, which also happens to be the newest addition to the deck, Stormcaller's Boon. This enchantment from Alara Reborn hits the 2 key points needed to boost both the Stormblade and Sureblade, as well as pump up the Thistledown Duo, in that it is blue-white and a permanent. As well, once it's on the board, you then have an instant speed spell just waiting to give all of your creatures flying at just the right moment, which may not seem like much, but it has won me games in the past. Most importantly though is this spell's Cascade ability, which will allow you to cast the next spell from the top of your deck with a CMC of 4 or less without paying its mana cost. Now keep in mind there is roughly a 9% chance you could essentially waste a counterspell this way, and a 7% chance you could send one of your Mulldrifters to the bottom of your deck, though that percentage obviously goes down for each one you've already cast or have in your hand. But other than that, odds are you're going to get immediate use out of any spell you pull. However, this isn't the type of spell you usually want to cast early in the game anyway, so if you do pull it early, you may want to hold on to it a little while until you've got at least a couple creatures on the board should you cascade into Wings of Hope, or better yet, Steel of the Godhead. Also, like I said before, this is the newest addition to the deck, so while my early testing has found it to be quite useful, you may not feel the same, in which case I'd suggest either sending it to the sideboard or cutting it for 2 more copies of another spell that better fits your playstyle, or even replacing it with 2 more lands. Speaking of lands and sideboards, let's quickly go over the mana base for this deck, and then we can close things out with some sideboard suggestions. Given this deck's average mana cost coming in around a relatively low 2.5, I've decided to go with just 18 lands. Now, for some, I can understand that being a bit too low. In that case, I'm sure you could trim the deck list a bit and bump it up to 20, but for me, I found 18 to work just fine. As well, despite the fact that in some of my other Pauper decks, I've been moving away from using a lot of come-into-play tap lands as they tend to slow these decks down, I've found that this deck doesn't seem to suffer from their inclusion. As such, aside from 5 islands and 5 plains, this deck contains 4 copies of Azorius Chancery, 2 Tranquil Coves, and 1 each of Lonely Sandbar and Secluded Steppe. I should also point out that I've recently tried cutting both a single island and plains to make way for 2 copies of Halimar Depths to potentially better aid Stormcaller Boon's Cascade ability, but I haven't done enough testing yet to see how well that change works. Now, moving on to the sideboard, first we have 1 extra Mulldrifter and 2 more copies of Preordain should a little bit of extra card draw be needed. I've also included 2 copies of Snap, and 2 copies of Mana War for when bouncing some creatures are in order. Mana War is especially useful, by the way, when paired with Deputy of Acquittals, as it will potentially allow you to cast it multiple times. Next, I've included 2 copies of Minister of Impediments for when you need more permanent tapping solutions than Somnomancer can provide. There are also 2 copies of Pacifism to lend a helping hand to Oblivion Ring when you find you just need a little bit more removal in the deck. And finally, 4 copies of Vedalken Outlander, because this 2/2 with protection from red says, "F*** you, Lightning Bolt, f*** you, and the red Pauper deck you rode in on." Now, I mentioned this in the last deck tech I did, but I think it's worth repeating. Sideboards, and even main decks to a certain extent, should reflect the current meta of where and who you play. So while this selection of cards works for me, you may find other cards more useful. For example, if you run into a lot of enchantment hate, maybe run a couple Oromancers in the sideboard. If you find Counterspell's double blue cost too heavy, try going with a more conditional counterspell that's easier to cast, like Remove Soul, or Daze, Prohibit, or Condescend. Or if you hate red decks even more than I do, throw a couple Hydroblasts into your sideboard. So long story short, at the end of the day, I say do what you need to do to make this deck yours. All I ask is if you have any suggestions or additions you think might work better, please let me know in the comments section below, as I'm always looking to improve my decks. And that's pretty much it for the Flight of the Godhead deck tech. I hope you enjoyed it, and if you did, be sure to check out our other deck techs, or the Mana Cave, as well as any other videos that Brainpulp has to offer. You can also follow and contact us on Twitter at BrainPulpTV, or you can follow me directly on Twitter at Geek Tragedy. And with that said, take care everyone, thank you so much for liking and subscribing, as it means a lot to us here. May all your decks go undefeated, and I'll see you all again real soon.